Well, thank you very much for that welcome. It's wonderful to be here in a room full of people over the last 2 days who, in different ways, are creating so much positive change in the world. A real privilege. And to listen to so many powerful stories of what it is that you're doing in your businesses and your communities. Now, before we move into the breakout sessions, I want to just take a couple of minutes to think with you about what is it deep down that inspires us to do this kind of work. What is it that makes us willing to step up in a very complex world to work that on the one hand can sound quite simple but is actually very challenging to do? And how might we inspire many more people, many more colleagues to step up in this way and be part of a shared value journey? 17 years ago, in 2001, I was an entrepreneur in the UK. I'd founded a number of businesses, I'd had my fair share of successes and failures, and I was at a point in my life when I was deeply asking myself a lot of questions about purpose. Really, why was I here? Really, what was I here to do? And how might I take this quest for purpose and embed it in a new startup, whatever it was I was going to do next? And at about that time, as I was asking all these questions, a friend of mine invited me to go on a trip to Ethiopia, to spend some time there with communities that were really struggling, very marginalized, in extreme poverty in some parts of the country. And so off I set to Ethiopia. I spent 10 days up on a very high plateau in an area where about 250,000 people lived, where they were struggling with irrigation projects in an area of extreme drought. And these were people eking out a living. They had nowhere else to go, eking out a living in a situation where it was very, very hard to grow the food they needed, and they were stuck really in a cycle of repeated famine. So I spent time with those communities, meeting with their leaders, and then end of the trip came and I found myself back in the city of Addis Ababa, getting ready to go. And on my last day, I went out to visit a slum on the edge of the city. And as I was standing there talking to some of the community, I caught sight of a woman who was crouched down on the ground before a fire outside of her little shack home. She was kind of separate from the rest of the community, and beside her, bundled up in a cloth, she had a small child wrapped up. And I said to my translator, I'd like to go over and see if we can speak with that woman. And so we walked across and asked the lady if she would speak with us, and she said yes, and we sat down on the ground to speak. And she started to tell me a little bit about her story. She described her 8-year-old son who was in school. She was very proud that he was in school. She was very proud that he was not working to support the family, but was getting an education. And she told me about her daughter, who was this child wrapped in a bundle beside her, who'd been born with cerebral palsy. When the daughter, 4 years ago, had arrived, her husband found he just couldn't cope. And so overnight, he left home. She'd not seen him since. And so here she was, making a living as best she could with these 2 children. She took me inside her home, no furniture, a pile of raggedy clothes on the floor that was the family wardrobe, and also the mattress. And as we came back outside and we sat back in the sun, I found myself completely lost for words. It was like there was this big yawning gap between us. And at the same time, there was no gap at all. I was sitting looking at a woman with whom I shared so much. And in that moment, I knew that I was part of Hasia's world. Her name was Hasia, part of Hasia's world, and that she was part of mine. I was part of her dignity and her grace and her drive to give her children opportunity. At the time, I had 3 small children. That was part of what was racing through my mind as I listened to her. But I was also part of the neighbours who shunned her and the community that had left her behind. And I felt in that moment what I can best describe as a mixture of shame and of deep connection, and somehow a huge appreciation for the gift of life. So I came home, and a couple of months later, I founded my next startup. Leaders Quest, it's the organisation I've led for the last 17 years. It was a new business model, a value proposition based on the idea that for business leaders like me, like you, to step up and help build a different future, sometimes we need a wake-up call. A reminder that we're part of something actually much bigger than ourselves, and that's an incredible opportunity as well as a responsibility. So we began creating experiential programs all over the world. Today we work in 25 different countries. And they're programs designed to do three things in a very short space of time. The first is to explore different perspectives, especially in a polarized world. We've been talking a little bit about that this morning, especially when we appear not to agree with one another, especially when we don't easily understand each other, to explore different perspectives, to recognize that the way that I see the world is only one point of view, and there's a lot of other valuable points of view out there. So what does that look like in practice? Well, for example, a couple of weeks ago, traveling to rural West Virginia with a group of Silicon Valley leaders to meet, amongst others, with miners there, to see what does the world look like through the eyes of these miners. To stay in a small town, in a motel, where the internet doesn't flow like water, and where the town is actually a food desert. And where many people really don't see any prospects for future jobs when their mine closes or automates. And asking, how do communities like this, how can they be included in these wonderful new economies that we're creating? What does growth look like here? And what might our role be in that? So different perspectives. The second thing is about giving people the opportunity to see the humanity of one another. What happened to me in Ethiopia? So taking a group of executives, for example, to China to meet with migrant workers working in a shoe factory with 20,000 employees, or a computer laptop factory with 40,000 people. Understanding what the young people there, where these workers come from, what do they aspire to, what's meaningful to them. And then tracing, in my case, the invisible thread between a young woman on the factory floor working a 12-second cycle time as part of the manufacturing process, and the laptop, the very same laptop model that I was carrying in my bag. Having a conversation with her about our families, putting a human face to that story. And the third thing is about what all of you do. It's about showing people abundant possibilities. It's about going out into the field, meeting people like yourselves, meeting your colleagues, seeing the businesses that you've created, seeing the opportunities that you've made, understanding how people think differently and innovatively about new products, new services, new markets. What does that take? And in particular, the personal and collective leadership and courage that's required, as well as the innovation and the strategy. We live in an amazing world, an awesome world, full of opportunity, sometimes very messy, complicated, moving very fast. And often, as we've heard today, we have the solutions that we're looking for. Much of the technology we need to address the kind of social and environmental challenges that we have, it's all sitting there. It's right in front of our noses. And in my experience, what very often gets in the way of making this stuff happen, and it's what you all deal with every day, of making this stuff happen, of building scale, of taking that Bain Capital example and applying it across the whole business rather than just one part of it, what often stands in the way is us, is people. Our fear of change and disruption, a sense of scarcity rather than abundance, the feeling that if we share something, maybe there'll be less for us, being overwhelmed by complexity and by the pace of change, and struggling to really step forward in that situation. And above all, this lack of connection, or you could call it empathy or compassion for other people, and actually also for ourselves, for what it is to be human. So you're all on this wonderful shared value path, and that's why you're here in this room. It's why, for me, it's such a pleasure to be with you. One of the leadership challenges I think that we face together is how we keep remaking that connection for ourselves with our shared humanity. And above all, how we encourage and help our colleagues and people perhaps who are not yet on this journey to step forward in the same way. In my experience, there are people in companies all over the world who are kind of buried, who are yearning for a sense of meaning. We heard about the CVs, resumes, people wanting, maybe this happens for you, people want to come and join the project, yearning for a sense of meaning. Oftentimes, it takes getting some of our senior leaders out into the field, you do this, showing them, connecting with the human rationale, thinking about what's the story I want to tell my children, or my nieces or nephews, or neighbours about what it is I do. Getting that human connection in order to catalyse the kind of change we want to see, in order to get people up and running in a way that they might not otherwise do, because it's a huge, huge motivator. So I encourage you in your work to be impatiently optimistic, as somebody said yesterday, or stubbornly optimistic, as we often say. We've got this extraordinary richness, this extraordinary diversity, there's so many extraordinary opportunities out there in the world around us. And for me, the business of how we show up, of the attitude we bring, the mindset we bring, the openness that we have to new ideas, this kind of deep personal work, this is the essence of leadership in a world where we're trying to create more shared value. And how we energize ourselves around that, the few moments that we take each day, the way we get up in the morning in order to go and make a difference. That nurturing of ourselves. One of the things we talk about in our work is love. Not always easy in a boardroom, but I love to do so. And it starts actually with taking care of ourselves. Because especially if you live in a world where you're out there trying to make positive change happen, busy people, huge amount on our plate. So there's a certain self-nurture. There's a reconnecting to the reasons that we do this kind of work that is hugely valuable in then being able to have yet more impact. So I thank you very much for welcoming me today. I thank you for the fabulous work that you're all doing in the world, and I wish you the very best of luck with that. We're now going to move into a 15-minute break, and I think it's going to come up on the slide there. You've chosen in advance groups to join. One of the groups, my Organisation Leaders Quest, is running. We look forward to seeing some of you there. Wish you a great break and a wonderful continuation of the day. Thank you.